Hello students, good afternoon. Welcome back to our discussion on literary criticism. We have already discussed the critical literary criticism practiced by critics like T.S. Eliot and I. Richards and discussed their significance as 20th century critics who played a major role in shaping the development of new criticism in the United States. Now, a third major literary critic, English literary critic, who also influenced the development of new criticism is the one that we are going to discuss during this hour, and that is R Leavis. Allow me to make a presentation to help you to understand R Leavis and his literary criticism in a more comprehensive manner. So just wait a second while I make the presentation. Just a second. That is not ready. Okay. I hope the screen is visible to you. You can see the image there of R Leavis, who lived from 1895 to 1978, and with a statement like this, like the one that is put up there on the slide, you can imagine what kind of a role he would have played as a literary critic. He said, or he is famous for having made a statement like this: literature is the supreme means by which you renew your sensuous and emotional life and learn a new awareness. So, that's taking literature to another level, literary studies or literary criticism to another level, and signifying the very close and integral connection that literature and literary criticism have with life itself, life and the society in general. That is the significant contribution of R Leavis, a person who actually made literary criticism a very serious enterprise. He is largely responsible for having elevated it to the level of a subject fit for study. If today you are sitting here in the 21st century in a country far away from England where R Leavis lived, and if you are made to study a subject like literary criticism, which many of you might not really like a great deal, in any case, if you are made to study literary criticism, a great deal of the responsibility for that lies on the shoulders of the person whose image you see here, R Leavis. He gave it the kind of academic quality which it did not have till then. Of course, we are familiar with literary criticism, as a very old kind of activity, in the sense of ancient. It is ancient, from the age times of Socrates and Plato and so on. You have literary criticism. Even in England, you have a long tradition of literary criticism. We are familiar with Sidney, with Ben Jonson, with Dr. Johnson, with the romantic poets like Wordsworth and all of them. They were all literary critics. But even when they published essays and other writings on which were known as literary criticism, even when they engaged in literary criticism, it was never really made a subject of study. It did not enter the academic space. It was not something that was taught. But he was a person with a very significant stint that he had in places like the University of Cambridge. He insisted that it should be made part of the curriculum because it has a very powerful a role, it plays a very powerful role in shaping the very vision of a particular age. And that is how it became very much a part of the curriculum. So just by way of introduction, I would like to tell you that, he was a person who was concerned not with literature per se. He was more concerned about the larger enterprise of culture. His primary concern was culture. And what did he mean by culture? He thought of culture as something that is very refined, something that is, very, very unique. In other words, or in one of his works, he has considered it to be an ordered and patterned way of living. So wherever you find order and pattern and a set pattern and by way of living, he would consider that as a cultured society. Okay, so culture was an ordered and patterned way of living. And literature is something that he saw as very closely connected with culture. Literature, he believed, was the storehouse of recorded values. And it has a very important role as the means to preserve and communicate to the future the cultural tradition of its age. That's investing literature with a great deal of responsibility. And it does not stop with literature. Literature on literature or literary criticism. He saw literary criticism as an important part of education. He insisted that it should be made part of the curriculum, that in elite centers of learning, we need to have literary criticism as an important subject because it is inevitable in the promotion of a distinctive culture. So literature and literary criticism both play a major role in preserving, promoting, and communicating to the future culture. So he valued both literature and literary criticism for values far beyond the aesthetic. That is, literature and literary criticism are not meant merely to please. Pleasure may be there, but that is not the be-all and end-all of any literary work. He attached great relevance to the moral function performed both by literature and literary criticism. They have a great responsibility to preserve and communicate culture. So the person who said all this is Frank Raymond Leavis. In all the caricatures that you will come across of Raymond Leavis, Frank F.R. Leavis, you will encounter him as a very serious, very a no-nonsense kind of person, and that was what he really was as an academic and as a critic. So he attended Cambridge University as a student. Then, like many people of his generation, he had to enlist in the First World War, but in the army, in the British Army, to participate in the First World War. But he insisted that he should not be given any duty on the field. He did not believe in killing, and he only worked or participated in the First World War as a ambulance, as part of the ambulance corps. In other words, his job was to carry stretchers with the dead and the injured. He did not want to have anything more to do with the war. Anyway, he, like many other youngsters of his generation, he had to enlist in the army. And then he began to work. After his stint on the battlefield, he came back to the academic world, and he taught in Cambridge University, in one of the colleges of Cambridge University. And then he went down to another college where he received his fellowship. This is just a brief biographical note on F.R. Leavis. He was a visiting professor at a number of English universities, has delivered some important lectures, and he was also decorated by the British government itself. He was made a Companion of Honor in 1978. Now, F.R. Leavis is a very important and influential literary critic. You may not consider him as the best literary critic, but the fact remains that he was very influential in establishing literary criticism as a branch of study. As I told you, his primary concern was with English literature as the expression of a distinctive culture. So literature is not just something that pleases you, but something that expresses a distinctive culture. And as part of his engagement with literary criticism, he championed it as, championed seriousness and moral depth in literature. He valued only those works as great which had a serious intent in them and which conveyed moral values. He stressed the importance of an informed. So it did not stop just with literary works, which he believed should be serious. The best literary works are those which are serious and which convey moral values. Beyond that, he stressed the importance of an informed and discriminating, a very intellectual, highly trained elite group, of readers, students, the audience, and so on. A great deal of responsibility rests on them too, according to Leavis. It is this educated, informed, discriminating elite, the audience, the readers, the students, and so on, whose existence within the university departments would help preserve the cultural continuity of English life and literature. So again, giving a great deal of importance to these purposes of literary studies and literary criticism. Yeah, one of the most influential figures in 20th century English literary criticism. He, as I told you, introduced seriousness into English studies and the modern university subject. If you study English, if you major in English, literary criticism becomes an inevitable part of it, and that was largely promoted by Leavis's approach to literary studies. He insisted that evaluation was the primary concern of criticism and that it must ensure that English criticism should be a living reality, operating as an informing spirit in society. He compared it to a kind of light. It should illuminate the society, and criticism should involve the shaping of contemporary sensibility. It's a big responsibility that he attributes to critics. Now, when you talk about F.R. Leavis, you cannot but mention, you cannot overlook the contribution and the very significant partnership that he had with another critic who went on to become his wife. Her name was Queenie Dorothy Roth. When after marriage, she was known as Q.D. Leavis, F.R. Leavis, and Q.D. Leavis, Queenie Dorothy Leavis. She was also a major critic, and she's authored many books of her own, especially works like Fiction and Reading Public, published in 1932. The 1930s was the major year of activity of the Leavises, but F.R. Leavis, of course, went on to play a major role as a critic late into his life. Till the 1970s, he was actually very active as a critic. You can even divide his literary career into various phases. We'll come to that soon. But we must make a mention of the journal that the two of them, along with another critic named L.C. Knights, published. This was Scrutiny. Scrutiny was a journal, a quarterly journal of literary criticism, which, as the title indicates, scrutinized contemporary works. It did not engage so much with works of the past, but they analyzed contemporary works, and the inclusion of works in Scrutiny was a mark of great acceptance in those times. So it played a very, it was a very important magazine, and writers would consider themselves privileged if their works were discussed in the pages of Scrutiny. So it was a very influential quarterly journal of criticism, and I think he is, of course, a prolific writer. He's written many works, some of them singly, some of them in partnership with others. In any case, this journal is often considered to be his greatest contribution to the field of literary criticism. And as I told you when I showed you that caricature, where he looks like a very strict person, he was always noted for the severity with which he engaged in literary criticism. And you do not have a person here who would relax. He had, he laid down severe rules, and he believed that literature should be closely related to the criticism of life, and that it is therefore a literary critic's duty to assess works according to the author's and the society's moral position. In the slide, you can see the names of some of his works. This is probably maybe 1/4 of his entire over. You can find the names of many more titles if you just do some extra reading on R Leavis, but we must definitely make a mention of some of these works, especially the first one, New Bearings in English Poetry, 1932. It was, it introduced him in a major way as a literary critic, and you can see the very powerful influence of T.S. Eliot in this work of literary criticism, as also you find in works like For Continuity and Culture and the Environment. They were all people who believed that culture is something very, very significant, and that literature has a very important role in dealing with that culture. It is part of a great tradition, and that it communicates to the future and all that. And then in the 1940s, the later, especially towards the second half of the 1940s, he turned his attention from poetry to fiction. That is the second phase of his career as a literary critic. And The Great Tradition is an important work of his, which deals with literary criticism of fiction. Again, literary criticism had largely always engaged with poetry. Poetry was the one genre that was always discussed the most, in exactly the way that Aristotle and Plato, for example, their engagement was with drama, because that was the major form of cultural expression during those ages. But in English criticism especially, literary criticism largely always focused on poetry. Of course, drama was also analyzed. We are familiar with the analysis of Shakespeare's plays from his own time onwards. But even, Shakespeare's plays were also written in the form of great poetry. You may consider that as poetry as well. But fiction, the new genre of fiction, for fiction to be subjected to literary criticism, again, the pioneer in that field, one of the first to do that was R Leavis. And you can see the best expression of that in a work like The Great Tradition. Then he went on to, as the title of the earlier book, Education and the University shows. So his engagement with poetry, then his engagement with fiction. And then he also spoke a great deal about including literary criticism in the curriculum. So the role of literature and literary criticism in education, in life in the society, and in life in general. So you can find those ideas expressed in works like Education and the University, and also in The Common Pursuit. But the last, towards the end of his career, from the 1970s onwards, you can find him becoming more and more philosophical. He becomes even more severe and even more strict as a critic, and the philosophical edge that he gives to literary criticism actually made him a rather unpopular literary critic. People could not really digest the kind of stand that he took when he became a very serious philosophic literary critic. In any case, this slide will tell you about the large number of works that he has produced and the long span of his career as a literary critic. So this is The Scrutiny, the journal that I mentioned earlier, which he founded along with his wife Q.D. Leavis and Elsie Knights in 1932. So the Scrutiny became the mouthpiece of their school of literary criticism. You may actually call it Cambridge criticism. Because he was so associated with Cambridge University, both as a student and as a teacher, and which is where he actually influenced his students and molded them into the kind of literary critics he, that he believed in. So you may call it a kind of Cambridge criticism. And the scrutiny became the mouthpiece of Cambridge criticism, upholding rigorous intellectual standards and attacking, those elitist literary journals and studies, which he thought characterized the Bloomsbury group. Alongside those, you have other critics like Virginia Woolf and so on. According to him, Virginia Woolf and her husband Leonard Woolf, and they belonged to another category of literary criticism. And according to R Leavis, they were actually not so concerned with the moral values embedded in literature. They were not so much concerned about literature as something that is preserves culture and communicates it and so on. They were people who were largely concerned with the craft of literature, the aesthetics of literature, the form and so on. They could not take it beyond the literary quality, literary features, according to R Leavis. So scrutiny was a very powerful journal. It provided a forum for identifying important contemporary work and for reviewing the traditional canon by comparably serious criteria. So the contemporary works were studied with great rigor, and when they took up works from the past, again, they were re-examined, actually re-scrutinized with more serious criteria. Yeah, well, I think we must take a look at the long career of R Leavis as a literary critic and look at the 4 stages. The first stage, as I told you, was one where he devoted himself exclusively to poetry, and he scrutinized contemporary poetry and also poetry from the earlier times. So from the 17th to the 20th century, he scrutinized and re-examined poetic works, and using very strict tools and so on. You can see the very powerful influence of T.S. Eliot on him during this phase. Then in the second phase, he turned his attention to the novel, and he gave, again, great importance to the moral values disseminated by the novelist. In the third phase of his literary career as a literary critic, he focused on social and educational issues and ensured the fact that literature and literary criticism became a serious part of the academic sphere. And finally, in the last phase, he became more or less philosophical in his approach to literary criticism. So in the first phase, the best expression of which you can find in works like New Bearings in English Poetry, he attacked the Victorian poetic ideal, suggesting 19th century poetry rejected the poetical and instead showed a separation of thought and feeling and a divorce from the real world. According to him, the poetry of that age, of the 19th century, it failed to meet his expectations. He was fond of Matthew Arnold, who was not just a poet but also a major critic. Both of them had similar ideas regarding poetry and its connection with culture. And you can also see the influence of T.S. Eliot on him, during the first phase. When he turned to fiction, again, as a critic of the novel, his main principle was that great novelists show an intense moral interest in life. And this moral interest actually determines the nature of their form in fiction. Now, the articles in Scrutiny, they actually scrutinized literary works. They made close study of literary works. They were not so much bothered about the biography of the author, as I told you, as it is with new critics and so on. They subjected the literary work or the poem to close scrutiny or close study. And it was for the first time that the fiction or the genre of fiction became subjected to this kind of study. In fiction also, close reading is possible. And we can focus on the language, the form, and the content of the work, rather than looking at the author and his background and his or her life and so on. So the close study of fiction was what he uh, to popularize during his career. And he especially upheld as good models the works of Jane Austen, George Eliot, Joseph Conrad, Hawthorne, Melville, D.H. Lawrence. To the surprise of many, actually he did not consider Dickens to be a part of this group, of the novelists he considered as great. But later he must have realized his mistake. In any case, he devoted a whole book to Dickens. During the 1960s or so, he wrote a book called Dickens the Novelist. Anyway, that is the great tradition. He attempted to set out his conception of the proper relationship between form and art, life, or it is not just the form, the manner in which the work is to be studied, but you need to look at the way it is connected with life as well. He refused to separate art from life, or the aesthetic or the formal from the moral. A great work is great, according to him, not just because of its aesthetic qualities, not just because of its language, images, and other formal features, but also for the moral stand that it takes. That was his stand. He insisted that the great novelist's preoccupation with form was a matter of responsibility towards a rich moral interest, and that works of art with a limited formal concern would always be of less quality. And you can read the chapter in your textbook on F R Leavis, and you will notice how one of the important tenets that your textbook highlights is his concept of the idea of enactment. What is enactment? He believes that literature is not merely a collection of words. Literature is something that enacts and demonstrates a moral sentiment. So it should be closely related to the criticism of life, and it is therefore much more than a mere combination of words. The idea of enactment is a significant point that you can attribute to F R Leavis. So artistic sincerity is realized in the work in its form and content, structure and movement, and it is not merely in its verbal level that a work is great. There is no aesthetics which is not connected to ethics. So this combination of aesthetics and ethics can be considered as the major feature of F R Leavis's criticism, literary criticism. Aesthetics plus ethics, art plus value, art plus morals, aesthetics and ethics. Yeah, so to conclude, these are some of the points, when you make a study of all the literary works of literary criticism written by F R Leavis, you can, I think, summarize these points. You can arrive at these points by way of a summary. He considers only those works of the past to have value which are relevant to the present. If they were relevant only to a particular time in the past, they have no value to him. So, he's a critic who's very much concerned about the value that is conveyed by the literary work. And the really good and serious work of literary work of the present, he believes, unlike T.S. Eliot, is nothing but a continuation of the really good and serious literature of the past. It belongs to that great tradition. And the serious, and what about literary criticism? He believed that the serious and the best form of literary criticism is one that engages with the present rather than the past. In other words, this does not mean that it is only the contemporary literary works that should be studied by the literary critic. Even when they study the works of the past, what the literary critic should look for should be how that work belonging to the past is relevant to the present. So that is why he believed that the best and the serious and the best form of literary criticism is the one that engages with the present rather than the past. And just like Matthew Arnold of the immediate previous generation, He believed that literary criticism is not interested in literature merely for the sake of literature, but it has a concern for the values of life that it promotes. So all in all, you may say that F.R. Leavis, by insisting on things that had not been really insisted on by many other critics, became a very influential figure in 20th century English literary criticism. He was singularly responsible for introducing that kind of seriousness into English studies. He insisted that evaluation was the primary concern of criticism, and that it must ensure that English literature should be a living reality operating as an informing spirit in society, that criticism should involve the shaping of contemporary sensibility. So it's all about the values of literature and the values of literary criticism. And for taking this kind of a stand, he often got into trouble, in the sense that many could not agree with the stand that was taken by this very influential critic. He was in a very powerful position as an important man of letters associated with the Cambridge University, and what he said would influence literary studies, and many were the critics who disagreed with him and actually argued with him on this matter. He refused to separate art from life, or the aesthetic or the formal from the moral. There were many others who believed that when you're talking about literature, you should not be talking about the values. You should, on the other hand, look at its aesthetic quality alone. So with poetry and with fiction, he believed that it is the value that matters most. Yeah, so it is for this reason, actually, that when he said that a writer who is concerned only with the formal content, the form, the manner of a work, that kind of writer, or the work of that kind of a writer, would be of lesser quality. This is where he was different from the new critics. His work, the way he focused on the scrutinized the work and subjected it to intense study, was something that influenced the new critics a great deal. But the difference between him and the new critics is something that you should be really aware of. It's not as if it is just a continuation of that. The new critics actually advocated close reading and detailed textual analysis of poetry over the various other approaches to literary criticism. They were not so much concerned about the values, the moral stand taken by the author, and so on. They were only looking at the language, the images, the metaphors, and other poetic and literary devices. And they were not interested in the mind and the personality of the poet or the writer, the literary history, the author's place in the history of ideas, or the political and social implications of the author's work. And that is where the new critics are different from Leavis. Both of them, both Leavis and the new critics like Clint Brooks, they take the work of art itself as the primary focus of critical discussion, but Leavis is ultimately different from them because he never adopted and was even hostile to a theory of art which is self-contained. He could never accept that kind of literary criticism. Art can never be self-contained. It must be connected to the society, and it must convey something to the society. And the literary critic should ensure that this communication takes place. So he did not agree with, or he was different from the new critics because he did not uphold a theory of art as something that is self-contained and self-sufficient, which is isolated from the society, culture, and the tradition. For him, all of these were integrally connected. So I will just conclude with another picture made by another caricaturist who has also succeeded in capturing that very severe aspect of F.R. Leavis as a literary critic, which is seen in his that steely glint in his eyes, the thick eyebrows and more so in the pointed finger. Somebody who therefore was always considered as a magisterial critic. Who's a magisterial critic? The meaning of the word magisterial is somebody who's very influential, but influential in a very imposing manner. They tend to impose their views on others. So magisterial, like a magister or the legal magister. So he's a magisterial critic, but we need to give him due credit for the fact that he was the one who elevated literary criticism to an activity that is interested in man, society, and civilization, and ensured the fact that it became a serious subject of study. So that is the contribution of F.R. Leavis to literary studies. Yeah, I think that's, yeah, the presentation ends there. Would you like to respond or ask questions, if any? So these are the three English critics that I need to discuss with you: T.S. Eliot, I.R. Richards, and F.R. Leavis. So we need to see the similarities between these critics. Most of them, were in the forefront as literary critics during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Of course, F.R. Leavis did continue to write till the 1970s, but the peak of his influence coincided with the peak of influence wielded by Eliot and I.R. Richards too. That would be the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And we need to see how the kind of assessment that they made, or the kind of practice of close reading, particularly practiced by I.R. Richards and F.R. Leavis, shaped new criticism. New criticism, unlike many other schools of literary criticism, which actually were quite, they would appear and then disappear in no time at all. New criticism, which was very, very powerful. It actually held sway for a very long period of time. For 30 or 40 years, new criticism was the predominant mode of literary criticism. The very fact that it was called new was because it was so different from old schools of literary criticism, and something that gave a new tone and texture to the practice of literary criticism. I'm sure you are studying some of the literary critics of the United States, those whom we consider as the new critics. Yeah, there is a whole chapter on new criticism, which we will be discussing actually. But from England and these three critics, in the next class we will be turning our attention to Russia. What happened in Russia, the influential school known as Russian formalism, which was also in many ways parallel to these, the practical criticism and enactment criticism, or Cambridge criticism, and also new criticism. So we'll discuss that in the next class. Only 15 have joined today. I'll stop the presentation here. Yeah. Is it clear? If our Leavis is... Chandana says yes. What about the others? Maria, Nandana, Arundhati, Sandra, Vaishnavi, Mary, Gayatri, Rubeha, Gopika.
Yes, ma'am.
Please read the chapter in your textbook, and I'm sure it will be clearer to you. Okay, shall I close now? Shall I wind up the class? Do you have any questions? No. Okay then.